All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the United States Military Academy, Class of 2006 War Studies Conference for our final morning of events. Our first panel today, The Great Untethering, Sharing the Cost of Today's Wars, will begin momentarily. After the panel, we'll take a short break, followed by the final event of the conference, a keynote by Mr. David Rothkopf. Our panel today is moderated by Mr. Peter Beinart of the City University of New York, a prolific author and columnist at The Atlantic. Mr. Beinart.
Thanks very much. So this panel is called The Great Untethering, Sharing the Cost of Today's Wars, and I will briefly introduce our panelists and then turn it over to them. To my immediate left is Benjamin Friedman, who's a visiting fellow at Ohio State and a fellow at the think tank Defense Priorities. Sarah Sewell is a professor at the at SAIS. John Caverly is an associate professor of strategy at the Naval War College, and Alice Hunt-Freed is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So we will start with Mr. Friedman, and then we'll go to the end to Ms. Friend, and then we'll come back and end with Sarah Sewell. Go ahead.
I want to start off with an observation that I'll try to explain in the next 10 minutes or so, which is that U.S. wars are becoming more frequent, more inconclusive, and less democratic. My explanation for that is that our wars, tragic as they are at least less likely to be costly enough in the human and financial sense for our democratic decision-making process to work well, to work as it's supposed to in some ways. And in that sense, I think we're victims of our good fortune as a very rich and safe country. Only a great power could make war, to use a provocative term, so casually in the political sense. So to proceed, I want to give two quick quotes by West Point alums. William Tecumseh Sherman, class of 1840, said famously, "War is cruelty, you cannot refine it." Robert E. Lee, class of I think it was 1829, whose career, I think, peaked as superintendent of West Point, told Longstreet famously at Fredericksburg, "It's well that war is so terrible, lest we should grow too fond of it." And I think what's happened is we've tried to refine war to limit its danger and destructiveness, and we've succeeded in making it less terrible, and therefore we've grown too fond of it. It's still terrible for some, but it's not broadly bad enough for the U.S. public or bad enough in a concentrated way to get robust debate. And I'm wary of trying to extract a trend out of current events, and I'm cognizant that 10 years ago, I think that was between surges, things looked quite different. We had manpower-intensive counterinsurgency campaigns, and that a very costly war could break out soon. But that said, I think there's a good reason to suspect that the period 10 years ago of heavy fighting and the wars will prove more anomalous than the present wars. The current situation, I think, is kind of extraordinary. What country was ever so willing to make war but so reluctant to bear its traditional costs as the United States right now? We're making war of some sort in 7 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, where we've conducted 5 air drone strikes this year; in Yemen, where there have been 7 drone strikes, and we're assisting the Saudis in their air campaign. 7 strikes this year and a big increase in them under Trump. Libya, where the Africa Command said we've done 8 strikes since September. Pakistan, also 5 strikes this year. And that, on top of that, there's special operations forces activities in places like Niger and the Philippines. So several points about the current wars. First, their costs are relatively low in historic terms. U.S. military personnel, mostly soldiers, of course, are still getting killed and wounded, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in numbers that are small relative to years ago in those countries, and certainly relative to other major wars. Since the start of 2017, 27 U.S. military personnel killed in Iraq, 16 in Afghanistan, 4, of course, in Niger, 1 in Yemen, and 1 in Syria, I believe. Financial costs, the wars cost now about $35 billion a year. It's hard to say because it comes out of the OCO budget, the Overseas Contingency Operation budget, which the DoD, the Pentagon says about half of that something like that goes to the wars. And that's a lot, $35 billion, a lot of money, but it's less than 5% of total military spending. It's under 1% of federal spending, and it's an imperceptible portion of gross domestic product. Another observation about the wars is this is a high number of conflicts, of course, and I think that reflects a long-term trend. As we heard yesterday, U.S. military interventions, which is a broader category than war, have grown more frequent, particularly since the Cold War. And there's a lot of, I think, pretty good data on that. And particularly, and then again, so since the Cold War, and then again more frequent since 9/11. Third observation about the wars is that they've grown lately, they've grown longer in duration. Now, I think that's disputable. It's disputable if they've grown longer in duration if you look all the way back in the 19th century, when we had Indian wars and so forth. But I think it's clear if you look just at the post-World War II era. And I think what's indisputable is that our wars or bombing campaigns that we've undertaken since September 11th, since 2001, have not ended. A bunch have begun, and none of them have truly ended. Of course, we've ramped down, but they haven't quite ended. So one reason for this outcome is the enemy. The terrorists that operate amid insurgencies and are very very hard to decisively defeat. But that, I think that point in some ways just leads to the question of why we then persist in using war as our main tool of counterterrorism. It's not inevitable. The United States didn't always do that. Other major Western powers don't do that, and they have counterterrorism problems. They have counterterrorism policies. So it's not inevitable. But this approach to warfare that is going on these days, I think, is consistent with what General Scales said yesterday about the American tradition of replacing manpower with technology. That means, you know, explains, I think, the long infatuation with strategic air power theory in the United States, what Elliot Cohen calls the mystique of U.S. air power. Now, maybe I think that mystique has been extended certainly to drones, which are maybe the quintessential example. It's sort of quintessential realization. And extended, I think, to cyber war and even ISR-fueled special operations raids. All of these things sort of promise a lot without the kinds of large-scale risks that you get when you send a brigade or something like that. And I don't think this tendency to swap machines for men is a entirely dominant or one-way trend in U.S. history, which is why we still have an army. It's still pretty big, but it is an important trend. One explanation for this trend is the historian Alex Rowlands, that the United States traditionally had a shortage of manpower and an abundance of capital, which meant that both in the industry and in the military, we replaced men with machines. And I think that's true, but I think there are more important reasons why we value manpower and protect it maybe more than other countries would in making war. One is liberalism. I think that's got something to do with it. Lewis Hartz's point that the U.S. is especially prone to, or has especially pure Lockean liberalism, I think still holds up today. And I think that liberalism creates greater reluctance to sacrifice people because of the value it puts on individuals, and because we wind up, even when we have other motives, we justify wars as liberal projects. I think that creates a greater, we always say that we're liberating people from dictators. I think that creates a greater reluctance to kill civilians in war and even to kill enemy soldiers. And that requires precision strikes, which are, of course, we need technology for. Third, there have been a series of institutional changes in how we make war that make them feel cheaper for most Americans. One's the all-volunteer force, and the other one is the tendency to fund wars with debt. Neither of those things are new, but a couple things have changed lately. One is that the costs of manpower in the military have gone up a lot. as a result of the wars, and that's related to the all-volunteer force, and that makes it harder to put a lot of people in the military and makes them more valuable. Another is, well, at the same time, you have this odd budgetary situation now. So we've funded wars with debt for a long time, but now we have a situation where the wars are the only thing that you could fund with debt, while you have a cap on the only part of the military that you can fund with debt, while you have a cap on military spending, which I think, you know, it means the Pentagon can come up with or cover shortfalls would otherwise suffer as a result of budget caps by using the war budget, which creates, I think, some odd or bad incentives. But the most important factor to me in explaining our tendency towards these kind of wars is what I would call relative power, which is basically U.S. wealth and military advantages. Wealth creation means that even expensive wars like Iraq are far less burdensome than past wars with equal or greater cost. So, for example, in 1953, the U.S. defense budget cost about 14% of GDP. More than half of that went to the Korean War. In 2008, we spent considerably more in defense in real terms than we did in 1953, about a third more, and about a third of it went to the wars, which was the peak year in war spending of the recent wars. Okay, but that was just 4.2% of GDP. So I'll just finish this point on the U.S. relative power. Today, as I said, we're at about 5% of the defense budget is going to war costs, and that's 3.3%. The overall defense budget is 3.3% of GDP, so it's a minuscule portion of our economy, and that means wars require less trade-offs. They don't require cuts in budgets for roads or even cuts to other military programs because of the way we fund them, at least fewer cuts, so that makes them feel cheap. And then military capability has given us a lot of opportunity to intervene in a lot of places, which I think in a complicated way has created this kind of paradox where as we become more powerful, we can intervene more, but as we become more powerful, the U.S. Public also becomes safer. That's what military capability does. It makes the U.S. public safer. So on the one hand, we're having more opportunities to intervene, and we do intervene more, but the public's stakes are lower. So the wars become more kind of esoteric, less attached to people's day-to-day lives, and therefore they're harder to justify. And I think that it's harder to ask for people to sacrifice and die in wars, even if you agree with them, that have kind of complex attachments to people's day-to-day safety. We only fight wars of choice in the United States, and that makes it a lot harder to sell them. And that doesn't mean the wars are wrong. It just means a sort of a complicated political environment. So I think if you want to do something about this, if you think this is bad, you have to find a way to concentrate the costs, not add to the costs, because that would be a bad thing to do, but concentrate the costs of today's wars through things like a war tax or caps that include war spending. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Alice?
Thanks. So I study two things. I study American civil relations, largely in an academic context, although also with my think tank cap on, and then African security issues, and usually the twain don't meet. But I'd like to spend my time today thinking through the U.S. Civil-military relations implications of the ambush on the joint Nigerian-U.S. patrol last October 4th. The Niger event raises exactly the questions we're discussing on this panel today, and I think it mixes some insights we already have from previous research and experience with perhaps some newer information. And there's three reasons I think this. First, by virtue of where it happened, the Niger ambush was a case of low public information about a strategically marginal operation. Most of what you heard Americans at all levels of involvement in government say after news of the ambush broke was, we have troops in Niger, and where the heck is Niger? In fact, Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright, who was one of the 4 soldiers killed that day, his family told the New York Times that they had to look Niger up on a map because they had no idea where he'd been sent. Second, the attack tests how Americans feel about U.S. casualties in the context of so-called light footprint, low profile partnered missions, that are part of a larger counterterrorism effort but aren't supposed to be high risk. So this helps us look at how the public responds to KIAs in a supposedly low-risk operating context, which is to say, if your expectation is that American personnel aren't in any danger and yet dangerous things happen to them anyway, how do you process the idea of casualties in that context? And third, it is a case that tests opinion on special operations forces activities in particular, as opposed to drone strikes or a major war, which is what we usually research on and test for. There's relatively little on SOF as the mode of using force in the social science record. All of these questions are inherently interesting for reasons of democratic accountability, but they're also interesting because they may reveal further information about how these types of use of force affect civ-mil relations at the societal level. What do these things have to do with how the public views the military? So this is civil-military relations as a dependent variable in this case. And it also helps us think through what does the state of public views of the military mean for how the public interprets events like the ambush in Niger. If civ-mil relations is the independent variable, does it affect opinion about casualties? So the causal arrow can point in many directions. So what do social scientists and practitioners think we already know about the effects of strategic context, mission type, and military means on public opinion of the use of force? And how might that opinion affect and be affected by civ-mil relations? There's been a lot of work digging into the assumptions about the US public's casualty aversion and the so-called Vietmalia syndrome that we revived in the 1990s. Gelpi, Fever, and Reifler in their book demonstrate that the public's expectations for mission success and their normative evaluations of policy goals impact how the public processes the fact of casualties, informing opinions about the use of force. So basically context and especially information and priming matter a lot. Meanwhile, my co-panelist, Dr. Caverly, showed how democracies can become highly tolerant of casualties when the average voter can outsource personal impact to others. And then in terms of thinking through lower risk missions, James Walsh has some very interesting research focusing on the use of drones and arguing that in the case of low or no risk to US personnel, civilian casualties become much more salient to the US public. He also argues that the more the public knows about civilian casualties, the more skeptical it is about drones. And several panelists yesterday referred to the high public approval of the military as an institution. And some scholars have looked at how the level of trust in government mediates the so-called rally round the flag effect. If you trust more in government, you're going to rally more. If you have a low level of trust in government, you'll rally less. So I wonder if perhaps trust in the military affects trust in missions or opinions of missions. And then the polling itself shows that the US public is fairly evenly split about the use of force as a general matter. Americans are very supportive of SOF, spending and growth, although Fox News found an even split on whether Americans supported replacing Army troops with SOF and cyber experts. I think this room will be happy about that. The public is markedly more conservative about using force against Iran and North Korea, but it favors overwhelming force against ISIS, and yet is evenly split about, quote, using overwhelming force to defeat terrorism around the world. So I was curious where this event in Niger fell in all of these findings. So I conducted a little plausibility study, and I used Twitter, and those of you who follow me on Twitter might have noticed that I was doing this. This is only slightly more scientific than the survey General Dubik mentioned doing yesterday, but just slightly. I tried to add a little rigor. And I did two things. I first reviewed the content of tweets about the ambush in about the immediate 45 days after the ambush, from October 4th itself to December 31st of 2017. And then I sent out 4 survey questions, and I'm going to send out more, but the last one was yesterday. And so first I did this tweet content review. And I found sort of 2 general things out there. One was we have troops in Niger, which was what we'd seen already through the media, but also an intense degree of partisanship in digesting this event. A lot of comparisons to Benghazi in a very partisan sense. Why isn't the president being treated to the same vitriol and level of scrutiny that the Obama administration was about Benghazi? Lots and lots of tweets on that. Lots of attacks on the president and how long it took him to comment publicly, and then the content of his, reported content of his conversation with one of the widows. And then references to other domestic controversies, like the kneeling protests during NFL games and so forth. Very little out there that express sort of the standard sense that if we take casualties, then we question the value of the mission, and much more immediate leaping to comparing it to domestic political goals and domestic political power, which I thought was fascinating because you don't see a lot of surveying on that, and you don't see a lot of research on that, although Jim Golby and Heidi Urban both have contributed a lot in this area. In the survey questions, I tried to be a little more traditional and ask folks that see my Twitter feed whether they favor or oppose U.S. military personnel accompanying local forces in West Africa on counterterrorism missions for an indefinite period if it puts those troops in danger. And I was surprised to see that 59% favored it. 24% said they opposed, and 17% said they were unsure. Those numbers only shifted a little bit when I dropped the indefinite period part and said that the mission was a training mission instead of a counterterrorism mission. Then only 56% of respondents favored it, 28% opposed, 16% didn't know. So the numbers didn't change a lot, but they changed a little. And then I tested the difference between drones and SOF. And I first asked, do you favor or oppose the use of, or rather, do you prefer drones or the use of special operations forces for counterterrorism missions? And the respondents were evenly split, 41% drones, 41% SOF, 18% didn't know. And then I had a bunch of people tweet at me, I wanted an it depends option, so I tried one of those and I said, drones, SOF, depends on casualties. And I didn't say civilian casualties or military casualties, I just said civilian casualties. And then it depends on a variety of factors. And that's what everybody wanted. 79% of respondents said it depends on a variety of factors, which coming out of OSD I can completely appreciate. Depends on casualties got 11% of the vote, and the remaining 5% were split evenly between drones and SOF. So I'm still thinking through all of this, and I really look forward to your comments. You know, my initial takeaways are that the American people, their views are still extremely malleable about operation type, and that context really, really matters to them. And that I'm not sure we can say much more than that at this point, but I hope to continue the research. And I think now it's Dr. Caverly's turn.
What Ben and Alice said. I can't do that. So before I start, since this is on the record, I'm going to do two things I don't normally do. One, I'm going to out myself not only as an employee of the Naval War College, but as a former naval officer. You'll see why that matters as I continue. The second is the views I present today do not represent those of the War College, United States Navy, Department of Defense, the United States government. And again, you will see why as I proceed. I'm going to make 4 quick points, many of them sort of complementary to what Alice and Ben said, and a lot of what we've talked about over the past day and a half. First on this idea, what I call turning war, mobilization for war into fiscal mobilization rather than social mobilization. This is a long-term trend that has been going on for several decades, and it certainly seems to be a trend that does not appear to be reversing itself. One important aspect of that is one of the questions, the prompt questions we got starts with as the costs of war become exorbitantly high, as Ben pointed out, they're not. Okay, we spend an eye-watering sum of money on defense, but as a percentage of our economy, it's actually quite small, especially when you consider deficit spending. Maybe that's a threat down the line, although we have this concept called Ricardian equivalence. That just means we're sort of borrowing based on an interest rate about what money's going to cost later. But again, it's pretty easy to fund these wars without breaking a sweat. The other thing to understand, and again, this is from the book that Alice so kindly cited, is that the costs of war financially are not distributed evenly throughout the United States. So the average voter, the DoD just released an annual report on how much the wars have cost in CENTCOM over the past decade. At its peak, the average voter in the median economic quintile paid $400 a year for those wars. And right now they cost that median voter $145 a year. Okay, now looking at people in the room, you guys are very well dressed. I assume you're in the fourth, or the second highest economic quintile. The cost for you all is $400 to $800. It's about 2 days at the Thayer Hotel on your vacation. Not that you would go here for your vacation, but that's a lot of war for the buck, okay? That's a pretty potent source of an equilibrium that's going to be very hard to get off of. And as Ben pointed out, that's also a recipe for overstretch and poor thinking. And I think we can make the case that there's a lot of that going around in United States foreign policy. And the second point, as I get increasingly in need of a disclaimer, again, the questions resolving around the difference in casualty aversion between the public and the military, sort of what does the public want, they kind of put the onus on the public. And I'm looking at you guys in uniform right now. I love you all, but like you guys are part of the problem too. This is exactly the military you've been lobbying for. Okay, you do very well by this. Okay, you have almost complete autonomy. I mean, even under Obama, guys, come on. All right, but especially under the current administration. Understandably, you're casualty averse. All right, why wouldn't you be? It's your life on the line. It's your people's life on the line. You love the toys that Congress is willing to provide you. I've worked on the Hill for a bit. I've worked with the lobbyists, right? You guys are amazing, okay? Again, you guys are, and I use that gender term rather specifically sometimes, y'all are part of the equilibrium, okay? This is a very stable equilibrium in the United States. And again, I loved Phil Carter's comment that, you know, the military is, as Rosa says, not that special. You guys are rent-seeking like the rest of the United States, okay? And you're just really good at it. So that's my second point, all right? That this is a partnership between the public and the United States military that's leading to this equilibrium. One of the questions we were given was, how does future war shape public attitudes? I'd like to reverse that and think about how public attitudes shape future war. Obviously, we're at an Army installation, so we've been spending a lot of time in CENTCOM. We have spent a little bit of time on this idea of drones and what drones do. I think one thing we don't acknowledge about the American way of war is how we've shifted in our counterterrorism operation. This is Obama's West Point speech in a nutshell. It's this combination of Reapers, drones, and money, not to be too mean to Warren Zevon. We talk a lot about drones, and they get a lot of attention, and as Alice pointed out, they get most of the research, both in kind of journalism, but also in academic research. And it's true, like, we're pretty good at that. Like, you know, being the third in command at ISIS is like being the drummer of Spinal Tap, right? You don't last long, but, you know, the band is still going to be around. When you look at drone strikes in the data, they're really good, all right? They're good at CT, okay? They're not good at necessarily taking out the entire organization. People talk about blowback, but actually, if we look at the blowback from civilian casualties and public opinion, it's actually pretty fleeting. Okay, drones don't have a very lasting strategic impact. But let me tell you, security cooperation, when you're sending arms, subsidized arms, to developing countries, right? And when you're training the militaries of under-institutionalized states, those have tremendous strategic impacts on both the domestic politics of those states and the national interests of the United States. And we do this without any thought right now. Okay, we are pretty indiscriminate about our security cooperation efforts. All right, we spend more money. We spend 10% of the global arms market, all right, is the United States paying other people to buy our weapons. That's 10% of the global arms market, okay? Our military support budget, our security cooperation budget, from foreign military financing to IMET and all that stuff, right? It's the size of Pakistan's defense budget, okay? We spend a ton of money on this, right? Again, because money is cheap and we'd rather have other people do the fighting for us. I think this is this dates back to the Nixon administration, okay? But don't think for a minute this doesn't have large strategic consequences that we're not grappling with right now. It's not just the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The other thing, and this is my Navy hat, right? No one's talked about the impending of future war. How does the DoD think about future war? All right, we have a new national defense strategy, and I actually take this one pretty seriously, all right? The era of great power competition is back, at least according to the Department of Defense. Now, I may have a problem with that, I may not agree with it, but that's what the consensus is. Now, obviously, as Ben would say, the consensus is actually we're going to fight in CENTCOM continuously, and we're going to prepare for war with China and Russia simultaneously. So we have the budget to do that, apparently. But think about this military that we're building, okay? We think about the third offset strategy. The enthusiasm for AI is real, okay? We're going to continually create an even more capital-intensive military that's going to have these effects that Ben is talking about in our strategic thinking. And now we're thinking about going toe-to-toe with rather large, great powers, potential peer competitors that are nuclear armed and are fighting in their backyard. Okay? How is that going to affect us? We're going to pour money into a certain type of military that we've already established, according to people at this panel, that we don't think very smartly about. Something to think about. That's my third point. A fourth point. The book talked a lot about the average voter, what technically we call the median voter. It's the person in that economic quintile. All right? And in a democracy, if everyone votes, then that person, in a bipartisan way, gets what they want. And this is what it'd be, health care or defense spending. One thing about the United States, as Rosa Brooks pointed out, right? The median voter in the United States is weird. Okay? We have this thing called the Electoral College. All right? I mean, does anyone in this room think that Trump is ever going to win the popular vote? No. Does anyone in this room think that if Trump runs for re-election, he has a good chance of winning? Yeah. Okay? And that is because the Constitution artificially makes the average voter more rural, poorer, whiter, less educated than the median. Okay? And then pile onto that the fact that, and it's a fact, right? One party right now has a pretty good idea that restricting the vote and voter suppression is a fundamental part of how they maintain that median voter. Okay? And so you need to think about what that median voter wants. Right? And let me tell you, for good news or bad news, it's a big old military, which is why Trump is really tying his identity to the military right now. So just to think about this a little bit, I went to the American National Election Studies. It's a big public opinion survey, and just briefly, in a minute, I'm going to tell you some of the findings. So I was looking for evidence that the median voter was doing a certain thing. Something I found out, and this gets on Colonel Urban's point that even though the military is very popular, it's gone down by 10% in terms of popularity over the past few years. One of the best measurements of support for the military that goes across years since 1980 is whether you support more spending or less spending for the United States military. The difference in parties is the largest it's ever been since 1980. Okay? And it's been going up basically steadily since 1990. So the gap between Republican partisans and Democratic partisans' support for more spending, both want more spending, right? Democrats are like, a little bit more. Republicans are a lot more. Okay, but that's a wide margin. Okay. So again, this gets back what Phil is saying. You all might not be interested in partisanship to channel Trotsky, but partisanship is really interested in you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Well, I have to say that I agree with much of what has been said beforehand, and so I'm going to try to not repeat the points that have been made very articulately, but maybe step away from what I had thought I was going to do and come back to this question of a gap in public understanding of military tools and the military as an institution, and a gap between civilian leaders who are nominally the head honchos in that civ-mil relationship and the military leaders that are their partners in that relationship. Because I think that all of the perturbations that we've talked about, whether it's partisanship or whether it's a lack of understanding about where forces are deployed or what their objectives are, there's a broad complicity across sectors in ill-equipping us to understand the choices and the consequences of the use of force in the United States. And last night, listening to General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker talk about it, there was almost this atavism about how the civ-mil relationship could be when a big ground war that had, unified operations and the president's full attention and was the focus of our foreign policy, allowed for certain things to happen. That's not the world in which we're operating today. And what does it mean for the public to have opinions if the public doesn't understand anything about the modern military or what it's doing out there in the world? And what does it mean for a commander-in-chief to deserve deference from those in uniform if the commander-in-chief is completely uninformed about the military tool and the military profession? So I want to just start by suggesting that there's an artificiality to this discussion because we're making assumptions that people have opinions that are based on something, or that people play roles based on a common understanding of how those roles are supposed to be parceled out and work. And I want to just challenge both of those assumptions. I want to focus less on the public opinion, where my colleagues spoke, and talk more about the civ-mil relationship as it works at the highest levels of decision making. And I want to reference a study that I did with John White about a decade ago, again in this Neanderthal time, in terms of the focus of the country was on a central front in the war on terror. And we interviewed most of the sort of the key service chiefs, the chairmen, many of the COCOMs, the secretaries of defense, deputy secretaries of defense, through a variety of different methods. And what we found in talking to the generation that was sort of still engaged in the policy discussion and able to participate in the interviews is that they had a certain set of assumptions about the civ-mil role that even now, 10 years later from where we were when we had those discussions, seem hopelessly outdated. They were just beginning to voice discomfort among themselves privately about the politicization of those in uniform and those recently out. There was a strong agreement that it was not a good idea for the military to play an active role in campaigns. There was strong agreement that if you were serving in uniform, you should not be writing op-eds about how force should not be used in place X, Y, or Z, as Chairman Powell did. There was a sense of a profession that needed to insulate itself and protect itself from abridging either its nonpartisan status or its need to be deferential to the democratic process when it came to the application of military force. And the dereliction of duty argument was seen as something that happened within closed doors, that was seen as a sacred obligation to provide honest advice and feedback to civilians, but to do so in a way that was fundamentally supportive of the civilian's right to be wrong. And I would argue that all of those things that seemed relatively a matter of consensus 10 years ago have all been essentially jettisoned in some way, shape, or form, and in particular recently. And I think the poster child for that, and I'm sorry I wasn't here earlier, so I don't know if you've already talked about this, but the fact that we've gone from a situation in which General Mattis's privately conveyed views became publicly known and were considered to be outliers and potentially problematic in the context of one role. And now we look to General Mattis as being our hope for constraining a civilian leadership that many people lack trust in, the judgment of. That tells you a lot about how we really don't have an enduring and stable set of expectations and roles for the civ-mil relationship right now. And I think that really suggests that maybe less the academics and more the professional class that has been engaged in adjudicating this relationship over the last decades needs to get its act together and start a public conversation about what this looks like today. So as we are finding out with the role of the presidency, much of what we assumed made the presidency work was not legislated. It was not a legal requirement. It was a set of assumptions about probity, about integrity, about the oath to the Constitution. We made assumptions about what would protect the behaviors of a president. We similarly make assumptions about what protects the rightness about the civ-mil relationship. We assume that civilian leaders will show a certain deference to the military on operational matters and on technical issues. And we assume that the military will recognize that the civilian leaders have a better sense of the pulse of the American people and have a more nuanced view of the tools of international power and our strategic goals and all the rest of that. I would argue that those are not assumptions that we can make today. I would argue that the average general officer is probably much more of a 360 educated strategic thinker than many of the civilian leaders that are involved in decisions about the use of force. And it's because, again, coming back to this gap, there's a huge gap in understanding. And it's part experiential, and it's part knowledge, and it's part what we share with people. The fact that, you know, we have this war powers resolution that essentially shields the American public from understanding what's going on under the nominal guise of informing them is really problematic. So I'm just going to throw those out there. I'm going to suggest that the military's instinct to continue to fight to win a war is something that is understudied in the civ-mil relationship. Everything seems to focus on the use of force as opposed to decisions to end force. And I think, you know, what we saw last night and what we must understand to be inherent in the roles is that if you give a military officer a mission, they are going to want to complete it successfully. And so there's an interesting moment in the civ-mil relationship as one is assessing the continued viability of military strategies, which are defaulted to because civilians just make assumptions about what the military tool can do and they don't necessarily understand its limitations. The military may be incentivized at the outset to explain those limitations, or it may not. General Petraeus gave us some good examples about how he wanted to reach beyond military decisions to point out how civilian decisions in non-military lanes would affect military operations, right? That's a different model altogether. But thinking about how you evaluate as a government the continued efficacy of your strategy when the people that you've tasked with winning it have to be invested in winning it in the ways that they know how and that they control. I think that's a whole separate issue that we need to look at. But the fundamental point that I want to make is that we do not, like, it's great that you're having this conference, but there is no national conversation about how to think about civil-military relations. There was a gap and there was a problem that I saw very clearly in terms of the public conversation 10 years ago. But the problem now is much, much worse. And I want to argue that it's worse for two different reasons. One, we have let the bad habits go for so long that we have forgotten how bad the habits are. Sorry. And the reality is that the politicization, that the partisanship, that the going outside of what we thought of as the lanes of nonpartisanship have gone too far, and the only people who can walk that back are people in uniform. And that conversation happens privately, and I know it happens privately. It doesn't happen publicly. We reify the U.S. military, and until people who wore the uniform proudly say this is out of bounds, the community is going to continue to act that way. And it's a profession, and if you want all the rights and the respect that goes with being a profession, you have to police yourself because that's a professional obligation, and it is not happening. And that is something that I think is a huge problem. The second issue is that it's not just AI that looms ahead in the future, and it's not just the forever war that looms ahead in the future. It's also cyber. So think about what the decisions about using force and continuing force and ending force are going to look like when we've moved from black and white military tool, non-military tool, to thinking instead about gray tools that are part military and part civilian, that are businesses that want to protect themselves in cyber and may be the ones that incite then the next level of escalation, where you've got a true integration of your civilian actors and your civilian tools with your military actors and your military tools. Where's the model for how we think about decision-making and responsibility, transparency and accountability when we have war that looks so very, very different, that we can see is going to look so very, very different, and that begins with the media and the press and the private sector and ends us up who knows where. So it's not your Tom Schilling civilians love to play with nuclear deterrence theory anymore. It's a very, very different world that we really have no models for grappling with the CivMil model.
Thanks very much. I really appreciated those comments, not only because you kept to the time, but because they were strikingly lacking in piety. So I want to try to push those of you who went out on a limb even further out on a limb, or ask you to, or at least think about some of the implications of some of these comments. Ben and John, you both, I felt like one way of summarizing what both of you were saying was that the fact that war is so cheap and easy for so many Americans is a threat to the world. And I wanted to ask about something that you got at the end, Ben, and to bring in anybody else who wants to talk about it, which is to say, are you suggesting that we as Americans need to think about ways for increasing the costs to Americans, or at least certain Americans, of these wars? And how would we go about doing that? Ben, you want to start? And then I'll let anyone else jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a bad idea, and for ethical and other reasons, to intentionally increase the cost of war. I mean, I don't think you should put skin in the game just so you have better decision making. I do think what you want to do, as I said, I think is concentrate the costs. I mean, my basic view is that the problem isn't that the costs are low necessarily, it's that they're diffuse. That, it's a few, an Athenian living in the time of the Peloponnesian Wars, the consequences of bad military defense, foreign policy decision-making where the city is sacked. Really bad things happen. For most Americans today, it's a few extra dollars on your tax bill and maybe bad images on TV. What to do about that, I think, because I think the causes are big and structural, it's hard. But I think if you can concentrate the cost somewhat and provoke some debate if you have, as I mentioned, a war tax, which means, I would say wars should be paid for now, one way or the other. And that's not going to make a big difference with drone strikes because they're so cheap, but if they're paid for now, that means that you either have to pay for them with an offset, which is going to upset somebody's political constituency, and create a debate, therefore, or pay for them with the war tax, which will get, I think, the right and the anti-tax people motivated. So that's at least a partial way to help.
Any of the rest of you want to join in on?
So I'm a political scientist, so I identify equilibria and don't tell you how to get off them. That's why they're equilibria. But honestly, like, if no party wants to change, where's the change going to come from? That's why it's called an equilibrium. Phil said something about a constitutional amendment saying we can't borrow. Like, that's not going to happen. As Phil himself said, that's not going to happen, right? Conscription, you guys don't want it, the people don't want it. And honestly, if you think about what are the likely things that get you off the equilibrium, it's going to take a military catastrophe that'll put 2005 in the shade. That's the only thing I can come up with.
I'm much more interested in two things. One, the fact that all the research shows us that the more detailed context the American public or those surveyed, which fluctuates from voters to just general public representation, when you give them more detail, their opinions get a lot sharper. Where you have the sort of even split, which to me is just ambiguity about the use of force, is where you ask them about general things. How do you feel about the use of force? How do you feel about war? How do you feel about drones versus soft? But if you say, in North Korea, you suddenly get very strong and clear opinions. So I think the education piece is incredibly important, which Sarah mentioned. And so that's less about imposing more costs, and that's about imposing more information. And I think related to that is figuring out ways to re-engage the Congress. Much as I also, as someone who worked in the executive branch, lived through the pain of working with Congress. I think it should be much more painful. I think someone else yesterday mentioned the invitation
Sorry, what
to
should be
struggle.
much more painful?
Working with Congress.
Oh, I see.
I think the executive and the Congress have to have a much more and less grandstanding conversations and more real conversations about where we're using force and why. I think, again, the Niger example showed how little exchange there really has been on a substantive level between the Hill and the White House on where we're sending forces and what they're doing there. And I think we have to engineer new solutions to that problem.
Divided government also, I should have said, I think helps. Divided government at least creates some greater impetus towards oversight. I think recent examples are not that encouraging, but it tends to create greater debate, at least.
Sarah, do you want to jump on that? Okay. I guess just sticking with this theme of the cost of wars before we go on to there were some of the really interesting points you made about partisanship and the military staying in its lane or not staying in its lane. I could imagine one response to some of this might be, well, yeah, the costs have been low for a bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons the costs have been relatively low, or low for a lot of people, is low for a lot of civilians, is because we've been in a world where, a relatively unipolar world, and as I think John was kind of implying, once more of our potential military interventions start running up against really, really powerful countries, then this equilibrium is going to have to change one way or the other. And I wonder whether, in terms of kind of thinking about how this is likely to play out over the next decade or so, you think that's a plausible story, again, for anybody.
Well, we've avoided great power wars for a long time, and I think maybe the next few years will be interesting, but I think that will continue. And so I don't think we're going to run into a big obstacle, including China, in that sense. Just as the Soviet Union in the last half of the Cold War actually wasn't the kind of obstacle that it was early in the Cold War. There was sort of more room to roam for the United States. I think that's generally been recognized. But I would say that the flip side of what I said about the public, these are low salience decisions, people are uninformed because they're rationally ignorant. The flip side is that when costs mount, you have a more informed public and better debates, and the sort of democratic process starts to work well, just on kind of it's unfortunate that it has to take a bit of tragedy, but that in the case of Iraq, I think things worked okay in terms of Congress getting engaged, but not immediately. So that's like the sort of sunny, optimistic point I can make.
I don't know. I mean, we now have a national security advisor who's said very publicly that basically the United States should recognize the independence of Taiwan. I mean, now maybe not going to do that, doesn't believe in that anymore, but it just seems to me like that we have a group of people in positions of power who seem like they're going to become only more aggressive in the U.S. in the South China Sea and be less and less willing to give China very much deference. So I don't know that you don't see a scenario in which the cost of America's kind of very forward-looking, kind of forward-reaching military posture could actually start to become more of a problem in terms of great power conflict?
I just think they're going to be really indirect. I think Dr. Sewell made that point too. We're going to be driven into cyber and economic competition. It's going to be hard to draw those causal lines. And so that's going to suppress visibility to the average the median American voter. So I think we're just going to compound the problem going into the future, even though it's perhaps great power competition. It's not going to look like competition we're used to, and we're not going to know how to process it.
Interesting. So you're saying it's not really going to affect ordinary Americans enough or have enough visibility that to create a different kind of public discussion?
I think it's going to drive up confusion. So I think it's going to affect them, but I don't think they're going to understand why. I don't think I'm going to understand why. So I don't know why I would expect my brother to in L.A.
So this gets to Alex's point about education, and it won't matter until it does. And the very famous line by Ambrose Bierce is, war is how Americans learn geography. Like, we just don't know about
where Niger is.
Exactly,
yeah.
Niger is a great example, right? I mean, it's a really searing anecdote that I'm going to use from now on about looking at the map. Great, listen, the Navy writes my paycheck, right? So as far as I'm concerned, the only place on the planet that matters right now is about a bunch of ocean the size of Texas, right, called the South China Sea, right? Because that's where all our budget money is going to come from. And wars between great powers, or especially nuclear armed great powers, are never deliberate. They're unintentional. They're accidental. All right? They come, as Peter pointed out, they come from friction, where China and the United States do not want to fight in the South China Sea. Okay? China and the United States are both worried about fighting in the South China Sea. Okay? Same thing in the Gulf when it comes to Iran. Okay? And if we create a military that we are well on our way, that is our primary response to these gray zone threats like cyber attacks, or maybe some kind of space-based threat to some of our satellites. And if the only thing we have in our toolbox is you guys in uniform, like that's destabilizing. Okay? If you create a very capitalized military that runs on autopilot that results in climbing up the escalation ladder very quickly, right? And that's what we think about South China Sea. Like something happens, and then 2 days later, everyone goes Winchester with a bunch of missiles gone. And now what, right? These are things that we need to think about. The structure of the military will drive what happens from inadvertent things that we can't anticipate.
Sarah, I want to bring you in. You made a point of saying that we're in a dangerous situation, if I understood correctly, because of the military, people in the military not respecting some of the boundaries that are supposed to govern how they interact politically. And I wanted to just ask you to sharpen that a little bit. We are, I think what was implicit in your question, what I heard in your question is that, to be honest, I think most of the journalists that I know, kind of left-leaning journalists that I know, and maybe most of the people I know, at the end of the day, will kind of hope that if Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and Donald Trump want to start a war with North Korea, that General Mattis will simply say no. Like, they're basically hoping for subordination in that context. And if pressed on it, I think they might say something along the lines of, look, yeah, I know that would be a violation of a really big, dangerous norm, but that horse has left the barn. Like, we have a president who's violating such profound norms already. It would be like the equivalent of people who said that, the Electoral College shouldn't have abided by the popular vote. Like, we're in a different world. And in this context, asking the military to pull back and give the civilian leaders freer rein, that maybe this is not the moment to make that our crusade. So I just wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit and ask you how you think about the military operating in a particular environment where it seems like a lot of norms are not being respected.
Yeah, no, first of all, I think the most important thing to say is it's not just the military that's at fault. Civilian leaders are at fault. The fact that civilian leaders don't school themselves on military power and then go into office and think that they can make informed decisions about military power that are not informed principally by the military professionals is a problem. So I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that I think this is a unilateral problem on one side. The public's not informed, the civilian leadership is spottily informed, and the military no longer has a clear sense of where those right and left lines are. So, the question that you're positing, Peter, is a little bit like Michael Walzer talking about supreme emergency in the context of using force, right? I mean, the reason why the moment is dangerous is because we've made assumptions about what civilian leaders will or won't do, and we now no longer believe we can trust in those assumptions by virtue of behavior that we've witnessed in the commander-in-chief. So then we have goals pitted against one another, maybe informed decision-making and the civil-military relationship that we believe we uphold and model and preach throughout the world, right? So people are going to have different opinions about that, but that's the moment, that's the crux, that's what's dangerous. And so I think the broader conversation really does have to be about how do we get the nation as a whole to have a more informed approach, both about the use of force, because I think there's been an implicit abdication of responsibility for having that conversation. And I really believe it is a critically important conversation. And I think we also have to ask ourselves whether or not we need to update this model for a future world in which the decisions are only going to become murkier and harder. So I believe that the atavism that we have about CivMil models per history and the Great Wars and per academic literature do not help us navigate the current moment. Neither the current administration and the question that you raised, or the future of warfare as I see it.
So how does, so what would be the kind of steps that could move us in that direction? And didn't President Obama, to some degree, at times suggest that he wanted to rebalance the relationship between the United States military and the rest of American foreign policy? And is there how successful was that effort?
Well, it's hard to talk about changes in the current administration when you have a State Department that is being fundamentally hollowed out, disparaged, and essentially hung up like the contractors in Iraq. I mean, in the current moment, every instinct is to reinforce the imbalance that I've seen evolve over the course of my career. And so I hate to put this on the uniformed military or the retired military community, but I do think that given a public opinion about the military, it behooves the military as a profession to engage in a more public conversation about what the profession entails. And if the obligations are to the Constitution versus to the commander-in-chief or versus to I'll tell you what I think the savvy military commander would do. The savvy military commander would start asking take a page out of General Petraeus' book from last night, asking for a series of hearings on the Hill where he would be asked questions about the strategic situation in which we find ourselves, the relative costs and risks, and use that as a different, within the CivMil lines, platform for educating a broader segment of the population, if not the Congress, if not the administration, about the way they see the world. That might be a way to thread the needle on this issue of deference to civilian authority and true concern about the judgments that might be made. But there's a broader, but this is a unique moment and a unique and acute challenge, but there's a broader conversation that needs to be had that can't be had just in conference rooms of people who are already, I think, acutely aware of the problem.
Can I jump in on that question you asked? Because I think what happened in the Obama administration was he succeeded in making the State Department more policy dominant in the foreign policy field, but didn't succeed in making the institution itself more resourced and therefore have a more lasting sort of heft in the interagency process. So DoD continued to have dramatically more resources and capabilities to bring to bear than the State Department did. And so as soon as you had a change in leadership that wanted more leadership out of DoD and did not care what the State Department thought, then the State Department didn't have anything else to bring, right? I mean, there's, and I think Secretary Tillerson sort of systematically got rid of what institutional heft he had. So I think that's, to me, the sort of how do you use your policymakers and how does the president and his immediate team lean on one institution or another is one thing, and then how do they invest in them for the future is another thing.
Why don't we open it up to questions?
No. No, I mean, I was asked a question about what are ways to try to navigate the current conundrum that we're talking about. And so one way is to try to respect the lanes but broaden the conversation and use it as an educational platform. I mean, one of the curses of the intense partisanship that has continued apace is, who goes on the Armed Services Committee, right? Not the critics, by and large, right? So the appropriators and the authorizers are not necessarily going to be asking the tough questions, and so you have to have people who who are patriots and who deeply understand these issues, like John McCain, to be your essential partners in trying to educate the American public. So that's just a suggestion for how to try to get out of what I see as the unhealthy choices that we face now as we think about the current political moment and decisions about the use of force. And the really uncomfortable reality that there are many among us who are hoping that the military will assert itself in ways that we would not want pursuant to our model of civ-mil relations in order to prevent a deeper catastrophe befalling American security policy.
Can I just say something
Yeah,
real
please.
quick? I don't think it's, I'll just argue with you slightly. I don't think it's partisanship that causes those committees to be full of non-critics of the thing that they're overseeing. You know, in the Common Defense, Sam Huntington, I think he called the Armed Services Committees real estate committees. And that was, less partisanship, and I think it was in the 1950s. So, there's less partisanship back then. It's very bipartisan to distribute the chits to, support military bases and production facilities. So I think, partisanship's to
Right,
blame
but
for lots
the
of things.
issue isn't appropriations per se. What we're talking about here is the application of force. And again, there aren't that many members of Congress anymore, I forget the stats, that actually have military experience, that are now overseeing military establishments. And the people on the intel committees are all in the secret world and they don't talk publicly. So we don't have good democratic mechanisms for beginning to elevate this conversation either. And then you add to that the fact that so many uses of force are sort of super compartmentalized, and that makes it a very obscure terrain to try to paint for Americans. And that's why they're always shocked that gambling's going on, when in fact everybody in the Congress has been duly informed and the notifications have been put in, but nobody was talking about why we were there, what we expect, and how we would know if we ought to change course because it's not working.
Other questions? Please, go ahead.
Dr. Sully, I think you touched on something that's sort of been the undertone for this entire conference, which is you've got this divorce between the civilians and the military. And we talk about Congress. There's been, everybody is down on Congress, but we voted for Congress, and I'm talking as a dyed-in-the-wool civilian. And most people, even of my age, don't know anybody in the military, have not served, never been around the military, and that's most of the country. And so I hear what you're saying about the hearings, but other than the hearings, what practical grassroots steps can we take as a country to reintroduce ourselves to each other? So therefore, we as voters become more educated and then vote for representatives who are more educated about military issues.
I would have to think about that a little more deeply than I'm going to be able to right now.
And I'll throw this out to the whole room. What can we do? What can we do to reintroduce ourselves to each other?
I honestly think that if we don't have a civics education that we ask everyone to undertake in the course of their public education, that we are doing ourselves a disservice. I understand that earlier there was a conversation about national service. Even if people aren't serving in the military, I think that's a way to begin to provoke a conversation about what citizenship entails and try to learn more about the different elements there. I think public leaders have become risk averse in many ways, and part of the reason why they don't educate is because they don't want to own problems. And so this notion of taking responsibility as civilian leaders for decisions about the use of force and bringing with that an education for something beyond just the initial decision to deploy, we kind of stop at that. And then we don't educate sort of how are we doing and where are we going and when are we having success or not. So I think there are different layers of addressing the problem. But I personally feel, as someone who had their kids go through public school and they never had a class on sort of basic civics, I feel that is an easily fixable problem that we don't talk about because we're not thinking about ways to bind the national fabric together at a whole bunch of different levels, which is again sort of a corollary of the partisanship that we're seeing.
I'm Jim Mann.
I'm
sorry.
going to go over here. Go ahead. Do we have a microphone over here?
Okay. I wanted to
We'll get to you, General.
stay on the subject of Congress.
Sorry, I wanted to actually have a woman ask the third question.
Oh, that's okay. So following up on Max's question, what can we do? I mean, I think there is a variety of things. I mean, get the military off the bases somewhat. I mean, rethink even like base housing. I mean, I live on Carlisle Barracks. I don't live on Carlisle Barracks. I work at Carlisle Barracks. It's this little tiny community, you know, if you've been there. But there are people, I mean, it's like 1950 USA. I mean, you can never leave the Bay. You cannot leave it if you don't need to. But it's in the middle of this wonderful city, I mean, this little town, which is Americana. But, you know, we have our own chapel. We've got, you know, the commissary and the BX and the daycare center. And you have all of this. And, you know, maybe rethink things like base housing. I mean, do you have to have it? I mean, and then do your comparative study. A lot of countries don't have it, and they don't have some of these gaps. Encourage the military to get off the bases and engage. I mean, those are your little centers, you know. First of all, so use those, get them out in the community. Look for ways to engage, and we can all help with this expertise as well. I mean, I was just explaining to someone, I've been involved in this project for 6 years. It's called the Mellon Project on Civil Military Education Cooperation. And we got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and we hooked up liberal arts colleges that are co-located with military education institutions. So in Carlisle, Army War College, Dickinson College. We expanded it. We have 13 schools. So the service academies have partners. And we even branched out like VMI and Washington and Lee. We're getting those populations together. I adjuncted Dickinson. I'm going back tonight. I'm hosting a national security roundtable at Dickinson. The Dickinson kids planned it. We're bringing over War College students, and they just sit around and they're talking about national security issues. You know, things. So there's things that we can do. And as educators, we got to think about what we can do on our campuses. ROTC, get them into your classrooms. Have some other events. They don't have to take a whole class. Plan some forum for them to show up to and meet each other. So, you know, I think there's lots of things we can do.
Do any of you want to respond to that? Go ahead.
Returning to Congress, because when we talk about even public attitudes impact is indirect compared to Congress. When the question is whether to initiate hostilities, Congress is the main authority, or it should be anyway. And to look at the history, you know, the modern history of casualty aversion starts with Vietnam, when George Bush Sr. said, we kicked at the Vietnam syndrome, and there was a Vietnam syndrome before where there was a Vietnamalia syndrome.
Yeah, that's why it's Vietnamalia.
That, what he was referring to, he had been through an episode where the Democrats on the Hill had predicted many more casualties in the Gulf War than there were. And
DIA predicted them.
Pardon?
DIA predicted them. We heard DIA's prediction. It was from DIA that the data came. The Democrats didn't make it up.
After that, this was something that the Republican hawks began to use against the Democrats. The Republicans then went through the Iraq War and managed to be obsessed with casualties on a much smaller level in Benghazi. The question is now, suppose the current administration were to ask for an authorization of force in dealing with Iran or North Korea, where do you think the Congress would be? Would it, on the one hand, simply defer to the president, as the Republican leadership has over and over again? Would it give more scrutiny to the request? Where do you think Congress would be, and do partisan factors make a difference, or would there be a more or less national consciousness?
Great. Who wants to jump in?
I don't think they'll ask for an authorization for the reasons that you know very well.
I would just just let me, if I can add something. I actually think that the trends in the Democratic Party may be leading towards less deference towards the military than we've seen in the past. I think the vote was held on the war in Yemen last week, and I don't actually think I think Bernie Sanders will go out in the 2020 presidential campaign and loud and call for cutting defense spending. And I would suspect that actually there'll be a bunch of other Democratic candidates who follow him down that path. And I think that we actually may be moving towards a Democratic Party which, as it moves left, becomes less afraid of being called anti-military and more willing to actually challenge some of these core norms. So I think perhaps some of this debate might shift in the years to come as the Democratic Party, in reaction to Donald Trump, decides that it doesn't have to follow by some of the limitations that it felt constrained by in the Clinton and Obama years.
You know, Louis Fisher, who writes about these things, talks about the explanation for the abdication. In his mind is I mean, I think it's what I said largely, that the costs are such that the Congress really has no incentive to get involved, but that it's partly at least the rise of partisanship, so that people don't identify themselves as senators, they identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats, and thus that they're willing to challenge presidents in the other party, but not in theirs. So this decline of institutional identity is a big deal, which I think is at least seems right to me, and that the partisanship evident in the Republican Party would these days, when it comes to military force, would be the same, even with the prospect of pretty high costs. Now, maybe the second, if there was a war and something horrible happened, or at least fairly costly, the next vote might be different. But at least the first time out, I think that's how it would go.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about across the panel, but the one thing that did catch my attention, I didn't want it to get away, was the ambush research that you did, and how the responses really kind of mirrored domestic partisan lines. I mean, it became a foil for another polarized partisan debate, probably associated with other issues that people had on their mind. And so I'm just wondering if our country, all of us are probably frustrated that this is not on the plate for our national conscience right now, civil-military relations. It may be, we see it all around us, but they really see the problem of Mike Flynn, or the problem of HR, or they see it through the lens of domestic political issues. I'm asking that. And is it just, so back to Sarah's point, we're going to have to police ourselves. We're going to have to reimagine the civil-military relations state of it on our own, because it's not going to be part of the national consciousness until it is. And right now we're still much more attuned to, are we ever going to get back to the Affordable Care Act? Are we ever going to get back to, finish discussions of the domestic agenda, which I felt really was turning the country's attention, even starting in the last administration. And the enduring cheap wars that we're fighting, they can go on as, we've mandated. And so I think that you're really onto something with that. But am I making too much, am I drawing too much out of what you were pulling out of your research?
No, I don't think so. This last part of the conversation filled me with woe, because we have a commander-in-chief right now who regularly stands in front of military audiences and says, "You voted for me, didn't you? You're with me, aren't you?" And we're getting into a partisan climate where at least one leader of one party is trying to set up a fight between different factions of civilians over the loyalty of the military. And that is astoundingly dangerous. And it looks to me from, again, my very unscientific review of a bunch of Twitter posts, like there's some fraction of the public that's going along with that, that's saying, fine, I will use opinions about the military and military operations as a litmus for, Americanism and patriotism and how I evaluate politicians. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous road to get down. And so I cringe when I hear, well, you know, perhaps the Democrats are going to start being anti-military. For one thing, not voting for OCO is not being anti-military per se. It's right.
Right. No, I meant risk. I meant risk the perception of being
exactly.
called
But you're right.
anti-military.
I mean, you're right to call that out. That's kind of where the conversation is.
Right.
Is that it's not going to see the nuance of, you know, Truman could tour the country and call into question military spending, and that was okay, and that's not okay anymore. And so I think we have to think through those things. And so I'm going to keep pushing at this and see if there's really the there that I'm worried there is.
Yeah. First of all, Peter, thanks for bringing together such a provocative panel. This has really been interesting. I'd kind of like to throw a lasso out and bring all of you into a couple of issues. The first, Ms. Friend, first of all, I'd go with Chuck and say the bringing up of that issue in Niger is critically important. But what I took from you, and I may have gotten the wrong information, you alluded to an uninterested oversight by Congress. And by the way, I think you're right. But then it goes to Dr. Sewell, and you talked about an uninformed public. And then Dr. Friedman and Dr. Cavanagh both discussed probably the unrecognized or maybe lack of rigor in terms of spending in two different areas. I just bring up, you know, my last job in when I left in 2013 as USAREUR commander, I sort of had oversight of U.S. Army Africa. And the reason I had oversight of it is because we were giving them the logistics and the money for their operations. There are 54 countries in Africa, and when I left in 2013, we had American forces in 39 of them. Many of them were either doing theater security cooperation, building forces. Some of them were doing counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency. Others were just delivering the IMET funding that you talked about. When you discuss the fact that General Waldhauser, and maybe General Jacoby can talk about this, General Waldhauser testified before Congress 3 different times in the last year and mentioned his operations in northern and western Africa. I'm sure General Rodriguez did before him and General Ham did before him. So Congress was aware, and to see our congressional representatives on both sides of the aisle say, gee, we didn't know what the hell was going on in Niger is, in my view, criminal. The fact that the Secretary of Defense also gets campaign plan updates on all the things that are going on in different parts of the world from his combatant commanders. I'm sure the Secretary of Defense in this administration, the one in the last administration, knew what was going on. So it tells me that it's not so much a lack of information, it's a lack of owning up to it, number one, from our oversight committees. From the American public, I agree, they are uninformed. And I personally would reach out to your brother in Los Angeles and have a conversation with him for an hour or so, but I don't think he's interested in me doing that about what's going on in the state of the world.
If you want to talk about video games, he would.
Well, and that's my other point, and this kind of gets to what Max was talking about too. How do we capture the interest? And truthfully, I don't think it is the outreach from the communities, because as a commanding general with all my soldiers, we used to do outreach all the time, and it didn't seem to make a difference because there is a lack of interest in these kind of things until we're asked to do something hard, and then everybody has an opinion on it.
Can we just finish up the question?
Yeah, the last part of the question is this, that it gets directly to the point of civil-military relations. Because the funding that Dr. Friedman and Dr. Cavanagh were talking about in both cases come as a direct connection, not from the military, but from the Department of Defense and the Department of State and USAID and other authorities that provide that money for ITEC or IFED or whatever kind of funding you're talking about. So here's the question, Peter. Thank you for drawing me to a close. How do we get the military to fix that? Because what I just heard was it's on us again to solve this problem. If I didn't hear that, that's what I thought I heard. Through more intensification of publicity, outreach, going to the neighbors, making people aware. I don't know how we do that. And I spent a life in the military, so I'd be interested in what your thoughts are.
I don't think
So
it's
these will be the
too
last comments. So why don't I give each of you the chance to respond to that, but also to offer any closing remarks that you'd like. Go ahead.
So I don't think it's the military's job. I think it's civilians' job to, Congress, wonks like me, folks in the administration, folks in the media, I don't know, what other states am I forgetting? I think it's much more on civilians at this point, and I think we have to continue to have the dialogue with each other about how best to communicate and which things to communicate. But I think, particularly when you think about Niger, it's much more on the Hill to figure out these wider questions. So the issue with Niger that I don't give Congress a pass, but I somewhat understand some of the response, is first of all, not every member of Congress gets the same amount of information because they're not all on the same committees and they don't all have the same clearances. But also, we were in Niger and we'd been notified about Niger through war powers and through security assistance reports, right? Those said things like, these are accompany missions, these are advised, we have ISR operators, we have engineers. None of this sounded like combat because it wasn't combat. And the war powers authorization happens for sort of technical reasons sometimes. And so nobody on the Hill was tracking that an engagement like what happened outside of Tongo Tongo could happen. And so that's the conversation we need to have. We need to say, well, what does an accompany mission mean? And what's the line between these advise assist missions and combat? So that's, I think there's a little more nuance there, and that's part of these conversations we have to have as we change how we use force, then the Hill needs to think through how it wants to be notified about how we're using force.
John, do you want to? John, you want to give your closing remarks?
Yeah, just real quick. This might be apocryphal, but Kissinger, as a reputative, said, like, the difference between Europeans and Americans, Americans have to talk about puzzles, right? And Europeans talk about dilemmas, okay? And that's because Americans think that puzzles, they can find a solution, whereas if you're a 19th century European and you're living in the middle of Europe, right, Germany is a dilemma, right? How do you handle Germany? How do you handle the rise of Russia? These sort of things. These are things that can't be solved, they can be managed, right? And the thing about civil-military relations is that, especially in a democracy, right, it's a dilemma, okay? It can only be managed. It cannot be solved. And so, General, what you're saying is a structural aspect of a liberal democracy that happens to have a giant military and thinks it has worldwide responsibilities. You are always going to have a disconnect, right? Because voters don't care, because that's how liberal democracies work. It's just that in other countries, those voters don't get a say, right? And so, again, the idea that it's the military's responsibility to change this is putting a lot of inappropriate emphasis on what the military is capable of doing. And, but it's also probably passing the buck to Congress. We could be sympathetic. I mean, how does Congress keep track of the number of things that are going on in AFRICOM? And AFRICOM is not even the most important part of the world if you're in Congress. So I think it's just a structural thing. And again, this is my political science hat. Like, we have to manage this dilemma, but don't think you're going to solve it. Dr. Sewell?
I think we have to disaggregate the question of public attitudes towards the use of force and the military generally, and the civil-military relationship as it joins the more elite government decision-making process. And on the former, I think I agree that it is a civilian responsibility to better educate the population, but I do want to point out that for members of the military, if I'm in their shoes, I'm not going to be arguing for a smaller defense budget. I'm not going to be talking about the limitations on the use of force. I'm not going to be saying there are all these things we can't do. So there is, it is unrealistic, I think, to expect that the military can contain what I would call the reification of the military as an institution and military tools. That has to come from civilians. And because, in part, this has been made partisan, and this is part of the sort of struggle for legitimacy in governance, it has become very difficult for Democrats to do that because they are immediately, as critics, one cannot be perceived as a constructive critic, one is perceived as an enemy. And that's a really dangerous place for us to be as a country, because we all recognize that if you only have a hammer, every problem is a nail, and yet we can't sort of get off that train. In terms of the decision-making and the questions about the use of force, I do, and questions about partisanship, all that other stuff, I do think that civil relations is in desperate need of a really close look, updated into the modern era, starting from where we are as opposed to starting from World War II or where we wish we could be in a more simplistic world. And I would be eager to join with anybody who wants to engage in that process.
The specific problem I was talking about with the Overseas Contingency Operation budget being a backdoor way for the Pentagon to get around caps, which is the fault of multiple, this bipartisan problem, cause, and definitely something the Pentagon signed up for over and over, is arguably could be getting solved by this huge infusion of cash that we're throwing at the Pentagon this year, because it may, through Mick Mulvaney at OMB, lead to them saying, okay, you got all this extra money, we'll cut down the OCO spending over the next few years. I'm not sure that will happen, but if it did, it would be a accidental good thing, in my point of view. To finish up, again, I think that the problem I identified as a product of the United States' good fortune of being rich and for great power, relatively safe. And so I don't think, in that sense, the things that would get rid of it are mostly bad. So it's something we're sort of stuck with. I think people talk a lot about what's unsustainable, but I think the big problem in U.S. public policy, and this isn't just defense, is the sustainability of dumb things, particularly when you're very rich. And so I think, being very rich allows us to sustain a lot of things that, in harder times we might not. And, it's the famous quote is, there's a lot of ruin in the nation. And it's ultimately good news that there's quite a great deal of ruin in the United States, which is to our benefit in the long term, but maybe means we have to live with some pretty bad policies for a while.
On that sobering note, thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you to all of you.
We were the happy panel.
What is that?
We were the happy
I
panel.
knew we'd be.
And ladies and gentlemen, for the sake of time, we're going to cut our break to 10 minutes so we can begin promptly at 10:15.
Peter, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.